The call came in on a Tuesday morning, a short report. 3 words, really. Strange animal behavior, the kind of call field teams receive dozens of times a season, usually a confused bird, a disoriented fox, something that wandered too close to a road, nothing that prepares you, nothing that makes you slow your steps before you even reach the door. But something made them slow. The shelter sat at the edge of a dry, rocky stretch of land, weathered wood, low roof, the kind of structure that looks like it's been forgotten by everyone except the wind. The team had parked 100 yards back, not protocol, just instinct, the kind of quiet that hangs over a place and tells you, without a single word, move carefully here. The lead field researcher raised one hand. The group stopped. Inside the shelter, through the gap in the warped wooden slats, something was there, curled low, still, eyes catching the pale morning light like 2 small embers. A Pallas's cat. She didn't move when they approached, didn't flatten her ears, didn't crouch into the defensive posture these animals are known for, that low, warning stillness before they vanish into the rocks like they were never there at all. She just stayed, body curved inward, paws tucked close, and beneath her, barely visible at first, a sound, thin, reedy, desperate, the cry of something very small, and very cold, and not doing well, not doing well, not doing. The team stood motionless for a long moment. Nobody spoke. In 15 years of wildlife fieldwork across Central Asia, the lead researcher had documented Pallas's cats in terrain most people never see. She knew their behavior, their boundaries, their instinct, above all else, to not be seen. A Pallas's cat near humans is a Pallas's cat making a mistake, and they don't make mistakes often. They are ancient survivors, cautious, solitary, built by 10,000 years of hard country to trust nothing that walks upright. And yet, she wasn't moving. One of the younger team members started to step forward. The researcher caught his arm. Not yet. She needed to see this first, needed to understand what she was looking at before anyone got closer, because already, something felt wrong. Not dangerous wrong, just off. The kind of feeling that settles in the chest when the thing in front of you doesn't match anything stored in memory. She raised her field binoculars slowly. The Pallas's cat's face came into focus. Calm, alert. Every few seconds her head would dip, just slightly downward, toward the sound, toward whatever was beneath her. The researcher shifted the angle, and then she saw the kitten. And then she saw the kitten. And then she saw Mulkenheimen. It was tiny, impossibly small against the dry ground. Its fur was pale, lighter than it should have been, lighter than the muted grays and ochres of a manual's coat. Its face was different too, rounder somehow. The markings weren't right. Even from this distance, even in the flat morning light, the researcher could tell, this kitten was not what she expected to see. She lowered the binoculars. The kitten cried again, high and weak, the sound of something running out of time. The Pallas's cat responded immediately, not with alarm, not with aggression, but with a slow, deliberate lean, her body adjusting, weight shifting, drawing the kitten closer into the warmth of her chest and belly. One broad paw moved, just slightly, to rest over the small, shivering form beneath her. The sound stopped. The researcher stood very still. Around her, nobody moved. Nobody reached for a clipboard or a radio or a sample kit. They just watched. Because there was something in that simple gesture, that quiet, unhurried act of warmth, that made all of them forget, for just a moment, that they were supposed to be working. They approached in stages, 5 steps. Wait, 5 more. Watch her eyes. The Pallas's cat tracked them without panic. Her pupils adjusted, her ears, broad, low-set, giving her that ancient flat-faced look that makes the species seem almost mythological, rotated once toward the sound of boots on dry ground, then returned forward, fixed on them, not threatening, not submissive, just present, aware, choosing, with full knowledge of what was in front of her, to stay exactly where she was. That was the part that didn't fit. A wild Pallas's cat that doesn't flee is either injured, cornered, or protecting something it can't bear to leave. The researcher had seen the first 2, but the third was something else. The kitten shifted beneath her, cried once more, softer this time. The cat's jaw tightened slightly. She exhaled through her nose, a long, slow breath in the cold morning air. And one of the team members, quietly, almost to himself, said the thing they were all beginning to think. That's not her baby. The researcher didn't answer, because she already knew. And if he was right, if that tiny, pale, wrong-furred kitten had nothing to do with this animal by blood or instinct or territory, then nothing about what they were seeing made any sense at all. A portion of car, of termedig by mofortielneming, except seed born incomplete. Should I continue to accept 2? You said, Act 2, Act 2, 06-23. Claude responded, ACT2, a bond no one could explain. ACT2, a bond no one could explain. They didn't rush. That was the first decision, and it mattered more than most people would understand. In field rescue work, urgency is always pulling at you. The instinct to move fast, to intervene, to fix, but experienced researchers know that urgency, unchecked, causes damage, stresses an animal past its threshold, breaks something fragile that you can't put back together in a lab. So they moved slowly. The lead researcher took point. One step at a time. Weight transferred carefully from heel to toe, boots finding the quietest ground. Behind her the team spread into a loose arc, wide enough to feel open, not a wall, not a trap, just people, just presence, giving the cat every chance to make her own choice. The Pallas's cat watched all of it. Her eyes moved from face to face with a calm that felt almost unsettling. These animals are not calm around humans. That's not their nature, not their history, not anything written into them by the centuries of open steppe they come from. They survive by disappearing, by being somewhere else before danger arrives. And yet here she was, tracking the team's movements with those wide amber eyes, her body still curved over the kitten, and doing absolutely nothing to leave. The kitten made a sound. She looked down, then back up. Stay, something in her posture said. I'm staying. A popripitun but befell. At about 4 meters, the researcher stopped. This was close enough to see everything clearly now. The kitten's shallow, rapid breathing, the slight tremble in its small body that comes not from cold alone but from exhaustion, the particular kind that sets in when a creature has been fighting to survive for too long without help. Its eyes were half open, unfocused. It wasn't in good shape. The Pallas's cat had one forepaw draped over it, not gripping, not pinning, just resting there, the way you might rest a hand on someone's shoulder in a hospital room, the way presence alone says something that words can't. The researcher crouched down slowly, eye level with the cat now. Neither dominant nor submissive, just level, meeting her where she was. The cat's ears rotated forward. She held her breath for a moment, then exhaled, a long visible breath in the cool air, and stayed exactly where she was. Behind the researcher, someone whispered, "She's not going to run." It wasn't a question. The decision to attempt separation didn't come easily. They discussed it quietly, a few steps back. The kitten needed examination. That much was clear. Its condition was declining, and whatever had brought it to this shelter, whatever had kept it alive until now, wasn't going to be enough much longer. They needed to know what they were dealing with. Species, age, injury, illness, but removing it meant going through her. And nobody on the team was comfortable with that. Not because the Pallas's cat was dangerous, though she was capable of it, capable of a speed and ferocity that would surprise anyone who'd never seen it, but because she had chosen this. She had made some quiet, uncomplicated decision to stay beside this kitten, and taking it from her felt like violating something they didn't have a name for yet. They moved in carefully anyway. 2 team members flanked wide. The researcher approached from the front, slow, low, speaking in the quiet, flat tone used around nervous animals, not soothing exactly, just human, just present. The cat stood, not aggressively. She rose from her crouch with that fluid, deliberate economy of movement that these animals have, and she positioned herself, body angled, one shoulder forward, between the kitten and the approaching hands. She didn't hiss, she didn't strike. She just stood there, and her posture said everything a hiss would have said, without any of the panic behind it. Not yet, not yet, you don't take this yet. Always win-win. Later, reviewing the field notes, the researcher would write simply, extraction required patience, which was accurate, the way a photograph is accurate, technically true, missing almost everything. What it required was stillness, repeated reassurance, a slow negotiation conducted entirely in movement and breath, and the willingness to stop the moment the cat's body tightened. 3 times they paused, waited, let her settle. On the fourth approach, the researcher's hands reached the kitten. The cat pressed forward, that one shoulder, that firm, quiet resistance, and the researcher felt the pressure against her wrists. Not aggression, just weight, just the last, wordless argument of an animal that had already decided something and wasn't ready to undecide it. The kitten was lifted, the cat stepped back, and then she did something that stopped everyone cold. She didn't leave, no burst through the gap in the shelter wall, no disappearance into the rocky scrub beyond. She simply stepped back, one step, two, and sat down, watching. Her tail curled once around her front paws, and her eyes stayed fixed on the kitten now wrapped in the researcher's hands. She was waiting. The team exchanged glances over their equipment and clipboards. Nobody said anything. They carried the kitten to the field vehicle, prepared the transport kit, moved with the quiet efficiency of people who know what they're doing and are doing it carefully. Before she climbed in, the researcher looked back toward the shelter. The Pallas's cat was still visible in the gap between the wooden slats, still sitting, still watching. The dry morning light fell across her broad, flat face and caught the pale ruff of fur around her neck, and for just a moment she looked like something painted rather than real, too still, too composed, too deliberately present to belong to a world that runs on instinct and hunger and survival. The vehicle started. She didn't move. A meal for lift to Mountain Devon. At the clinic, the kitten was placed under a heat lamp immediately. The vet on duty worked quickly, hands practiced, expression neutral, temperature, hydration, respiration. The researcher stood nearby and answered questions in short sentences. Found in a shelter, approximately 3 hours northeast. The Pallas's cat was present when we arrived. The vet glanced up briefly at that last part, then returned to the kitten. The examination continued for several minutes in silence, and then, slowly, the vet's hands stopped moving. She was looking at something, closely, the way a person looks at something when they need a moment to make sure they're seeing it correctly before they say it out loud. The researcher stepped forward. "What is it?" The vet didn't answer right away. She looked up, then back down, then carefully, quietly, she set her instruments aside, and what she said next changed everything they thought they understood about why that cat had stayed. Afghan to Ndandi P2 story Nanda. ACT2 complete. Should I continue to ACT3? You said Act 3, and Nondand, 0625. Claude responded, ACT3, the truth that made them cry. ACT3, the truth that made them cry. The kitten weighed less than it should have. That was the first thing the vet noted, not dramatically, just a number written into a field log in careful handwriting. A number that on its own tells a quiet and terrible story. Weight loss in a young animal happens fast, faster than most people realize. The body burns through reserves in hours, not days, when the temperature drops and there's no warmth, no milk, no shelter from wind that cuts across open rocky ground without apology. The vet worked through the examination methodically. Eyes, gums, skin elasticity, the simple ancient test of pinching the scruff and watching how slowly it returns to place. In a healthy, hydrated animal, the skin snaps back instantly. Here it moved like something tired, like it had forgotten how to hurry. Dehydration, significant. The researcher watched from the doorway and said nothing. Outside, somewhere in the direction they had come from, a Pallas's cat was still sitting beside an empty shelter, still waiting. The researcher kept thinking about that, kept returning to it the way you return to a detail that doesn't fit, worrying at it quietly while the rest of your mind tries to stay focused on the work in front of you. Why didn't she leave? The vet straightened up slowly. She didn't reach for the next instrument, didn't move to the next item on her mental checklist. She just stood for a moment with her hands resting on the edge of the examination table and looked at the kitten beneath the heat lamp, its small sides rising and falling with a steadiness that was only just beginning to feel reliable. "How long do you think it was out there?" she asked. The researcher considered, thought about the shelter, the ground around it, the way the kitten had been lying, the particular limpness that comes not from sleep but from a body that has been conserving everything it has left. "Days," she said, "at least." The vet nodded slowly, like she'd already known the answer but needed to hear it said out loud. Then she found it in that condition. Not a question. The researcher understood immediately what was being said and what it meant, not just for the kitten, for everything. But the species question had been there since the beginning, sitting quietly in the background of everything. The kitten wasn't a manual. That much had been clear from the first moment in the shelter. the fur, the coloring, the shape of the face. The team had noted it and set it aside, focused on the immediate work of safe extraction, but now, in the clean light of the clinic, the vet confirmed it plainly. Domestic cat, young, 4 to 5 weeks approximately. Born somewhere nearby, a farmstead perhaps, or a structure on the outer edge of settled land, separated from its mother by something, predator, accident, displacement, there was no way to know exactly. But separated completely, and for long enough that survival, without intervention, had become a matter of hours rather than days. The researcher stood very still. She was doing the math that the vet had already done. The kitten had been alone, no mother, no litter, no warmth except what the earth grudgingly offered through the floor of a wooden shelter that was barely a shelter at all. And in that time, in those days of cold and thirst and the specific, consuming fear that a small animal carries when it is alone in open country, something had found it. Not a predator, not something passing through, something that had stopped and stayed. Not of people can along. A Pallas's cat's diet is opportunistic, rodents primarily, small birds, the occasional larger prey when the season allows. They are efficient hunters, low to the ground, patient, capable of waiting motionless for long stretches before striking with a precision that looks almost casual. A small, weak, isolated kitten would register to that sensory system as prey. That is simply biology, not cruelty, not indifference. Just the clean, unsentimental logic of survival in hard country. The vet said this carefully, not to be harsh, but because accuracy mattered here, because the truth of what the Pallas's cat had done only lands fully when you understand what she hadn't done first. She hadn't hunted it. She had found something helpless, alone and failing, something that by every instinct available to her should have triggered a completely different response, and she had curled around it instead, kept it warm, kept it breathing, put her own body between it and the cold and the open sky and whatever else moves through rocky terrain after dark. The researcher felt something shift in her chest, the particular feeling of a fact landing in a place that isn't your mind. They sat with it for a while. The clinic was quiet, just the hum of equipment, the soft sound of the heat lamp, the kitten's breathing growing gradually more even beneath its warmth. The vet had stepped back from the table. The researcher was still in the doorway. Neither of them spoke for what felt like a long time. It was the vet who finally said it, quietly, not for effect, just because it was true and it needed saying. She stayed when instinct said leave. The researcher didn't answer. She was thinking about the shelter, about the gap in the wooden slats, about a wild animal sitting in the morning light with her tail curled around her paws, watching a vehicle drive away and not moving, choosing in that particular and unrepeatable moment something that had no name in any field manual she had ever read. They stabilized the kitten through the afternoon. Fluids, warmth, the careful, patient work of bringing something back from the edge without startling it further away. By evening its eyes were clearer. By the following morning it had accepted food, small amounts, carefully introduced, and the vet allowed herself, for the first time, a cautious optimism. Fragile, she said, but holding. The researcher wrote that in her notes. Then she set her pen down and looked out the clinic window at the dry, pale landscape stretched out toward the horizon, the rocks, the scrub, the wide and indifferent sky, and thought about what was still out there, somewhere in that direction, waiting. The question was no longer whether the kitten would survive. The question, the one that had been building quietly since the moment they'd driven away from that shelter, was what happened now, because the kitten was recovering, and the Pallas's cat was still there. And bringing them back together meant something that nobody on the team had encountered before, something that sat right at the edge of everything they thought they understood about the line between instinct and something older, something quieter, something that didn't have a clean scientific category and maybe didn't need one. What happens when an animal chooses a bond that makes no evolutionary sense? What happens when you ask nature to explain something nature itself seems surprised by? The researcher picked up her pen again and wrote the only honest thing she could. We don't know yet. Ascot 3 complete. Should I continue to Ascot 4? You said Act 4. Act 4, 0626. Claude responded, AC Tech 4, something beyond instinct. AC Tech 4, something beyond instinct. Recovery is never a straight line. Anyone who has worked in wildlife care long enough knows this, knows it not as a professional observation but as something felt, personally, in the small hours of the morning when you're checking on an animal that was doing well yesterday and isn't doing as well today. Progress comes in increments so small they're almost invisible. Then it stalls, then it moves again, then it stalls again. And somewhere in that uneven, unglamorous process, if everything goes quietly right, something tips, some internal threshold crosses, and the animal on the other side of that threshold is different from the one that arrived. The kitten crossed that threshold on the 4th day. Nothing dramatic marked it. No single moment the team could point to later and say, "There, that's when it happened." It was more like a gradual brightening, the eyes a little more focused each morning, the movements a little more deliberate, the interest in food shifting from reluctant acceptance to something closer to demand. Small things, the kind of small things that mean everything when you've been watching closely enough to know what their absence looked like. The vet noted it in her log with characteristic understatement. Condition, improving. Prognosis, cautiously favorable. The researcher read it and allowed herself a quiet exhale. Agwondhamla, the Romani Bontamla Latindo. Through those 4 days, something else had been noted, something that required its own log entries, its own careful documentation, because it was the kind of observation that needed to be recorded accurately, not dramatized, not minimized, but written down plainly so that anyone reading it later would understand exactly what had been observed and draw their own conclusions. The Pallas's cat had not left the area. Field cameras confirmed it. Motion triggered, positioned along the rocky perimeter around the shelter, they captured her in the blue-gray light of early morning, in the flat midday heat, in the long amber shadows of late afternoon, always within a certain radius, always oriented, in her stillness, toward the direction the vehicle had gone. She was hunting. The cameras caught that too, brief and efficient forays into the scrub that lasted less than an hour before she returned. She was eating. She was maintaining herself with the quiet competence of a wild animal that knows how to survive in hard country. But she wasn't leaving. The lead researcher reviewed the footage each evening and tried to find the clinical language for what she was watching. Territorial behavior didn't fit. This wasn't her established range. Stress response didn't fit either. Her movements were calm, unhurried, purposeful. She wasn't pacing. She wasn't searching frantically. She was simply present, waiting with a patience that felt, in the footage, almost meditative. Amenos metabedded, amenos modimos mogenov. The reunion was not decided quickly. There were real concerns, legitimate ones, the kind that responsible fieldwork requires you to take seriously rather than wave aside in favor of a more satisfying narrative. A wild Pallas's cat and a recovering domestic kitten are not, by any standard framework, a safe combination. The cat's behavior had been extraordinary, yes, but extraordinary behavior under one set of conditions doesn't guarantee identical behavior under different ones. Stress changes animals, hunger changes them. The reintroduction of a stimulus in a new context can trigger responses that the original encounter never suggested. The team discussed it carefully, weighed the risks, consulted, reviewed the field footage again, watched the way the cat moved, the way she rested, the particular quality of her stillness near the shelter, that unhurried, deliberate calm that had been present since the first morning and hadn't changed. The vet made the final call. Controlled proximity, she said. Observe. Be ready to intervene, but let them tell us. And they brought the kitten back to the shelter on the morning of the 5th day. The researcher carried it in a ventilated transport box, small, secure, the kitten visible through the mesh sides, its eyes wide and alert in the way of an animal that is well enough now to be curious about the world again. The team moved quietly, no unnecessary equipment, no crowd. Just the core group, spread wide, moving with the careful deliberateness that had characterized every step of this from the beginning. The field cameras had shown the Pallas's cat near the shelter at dawn. As they approached, the researcher scanned the rocky ground ahead, and there she was. Same position as the first morning, almost exactly, sitting low near the shelter entrance, broad face forward, amber eyes tracking the approaching figures with that same unsettling calm. Her tail moved once, a single slow arc, and then stilled. The researcher set the transport box down at a distance of about 3 meters, stepped back, and they waited. Orange, from, amenof poicultor, furum tioe. The kitten made a sound, not distress, something different. The particular vocalization of a small animal registering something familiar, something its nervous system recognized before its conscious awareness caught up. A short, thin sound, almost a question. The Pallas's cat's ears moved instantly. Both of them, rotating forward with that precise, satellite dish focus, locking onto the sound with an accuracy that was purely biological, purely automatic, and yet somehow looked, in that moment, like attention, like recognition. She stood, crossed the distance in 4 unhurried steps, lowered her head to the mesh of the transport box. The kitten pressed forward from the inside, small nose to the mesh, reaching toward her, and for a long moment they were simply still, breathing the same air through the small gaps in the carrier wall, the cat's eyes half closed. The kitten's frantic energy settling, visibly, into something quieter. The researcher realized she was holding her breath. She let it out slowly. Behind her, she heard someone make a sound, not a word, just a sound, the involuntary exhale of a person watching something they weren't entirely prepared for. The vet, standing to her left, said nothing. Her hand moved to write something in her field notebook, then stopped. Some moments resist being reduced to notes. A movement of form. They opened the carrier carefully. The kitten emerged slowly, cautious, legs a little unsteady still, nose working the air with the focused industry of a creature recalibrating to open space. It took 3 steps. Paused, looked up. The Pallas's cat lowered herself to the ground. Not a hunting crouch, something else entirely. A deliberate, unhurried folding of her body into a low, open position, accessible, unthreatening. The posture of an animal making itself smaller so that something smaller still would feel safe. The kitten walked the remaining distance and pressed itself against her side. The cat exhaled once, long and slow. Her eyes moved to the humans watching from a distance, held them for a moment with that ancient, unreadable calm, and then she looked away, back down, toward the small, warm weight settled against her, her chin lowered to rest on her own forepaws, and that was all. Ba monitored for 3 more days, fed her near the shelter so she wouldn't need to range far, checked the kitten's condition morning and evening, kept their distance, let the 2 of them exist in whatever quiet arrangement they had arrived at. The wild cat and the small domestic kitten curled into her warmth each night as the temperature dropped and the stars came out over the dry, rocky land. On the morning of the 8th day, the researcher arrived at the shelter just after sunrise. She stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time. The shelter was empty, no cat, no kitten. The ground undisturbed except for the faint, round impressions in the dust near the entrance, small marks, 2 sets, leading away together toward the scrub and the rocks in the wide open country beyond. She didn't follow. She stood in the early morning light and looked at those tracks for a while, and then she turned and walked back to the vehicle and sat for a moment, before starting the engine. Juan de Poesia de Bayonne. Documented dates, behaviors, observations, outcomes. Used the careful, measured language of someone who takes accuracy seriously and understands that accuracy is a form of respect, for the work, for the animals, for the people who will read these pages later and need to trust what's written in them. At the end she paused. Then she wrote one final line. Not clinical, not measured, just true. In all our years studying the wild, we had never seen anything like it, because sometimes instinct isn't the strongest force in nature. She closed the notebook. Outside, the land stretched away in every direction, quiet, vast, indifferent to the small and extraordinary thing that had happened at its edge. The rocks held their heat from the day. The first stars were appearing in the pale upper sky. Somewhere out there, in the direction of the tracks, 2 animals were moving through the cooling evening air, and together, for whatever time the wild allows, and that, somehow, was enough.